The biting Chicago wind whipped Margaret's wrinkled face as she huddled under an old, torn blanket. At X years old, his trembling hands clung to a rusty shopping cart, his only companion on the city's icy streets. One more day, Margaret murmured to herself, her husky voice breaking the early morning silence. Just one more day to survive. As the rising sun painted the sky orange, Margaret closed her eyes, letting memories flood her tired mind. He remembered a time not so long ago, when the smell of chalk and new books filled his days. "Good morning, class." Margaret's voice echoed in his memory, young and full of hope. "Today we will learn about the power of words." A sob escaped his parched lips. How had things changed so drastically? The streets were unforgiving, and each day was a battle against the cold, hunger, and despair. Margaret opened her eyes, facing the cruel reality that surrounded her. People hurried past, avoiding his gaze. She could feel the weight of her invisibility, crushing her chest like a rock. "Please," she whispered to a man in a suit who passed her, "any help would be." But his words were swallowed by the noise of the city. The man didn't even slow down. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. I used to be someone, she thought, the pain of loss of identity cutting her insides. I made a difference. She looked at her calloused hands, remembering how they used to hold books with care, correct essays with attention. Now, those same hands rummaged through dumpsters looking for leftovers. Margaret's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. Hunger was a constant companion, as was fear. Fear of not waking up the next morning, fear of being attacked during the night, fear of never feeling the warmth of a hug again. "God," she murmured, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, "why did you abandon me?" Margaret struggled to her feet, her bones aching from the effort. She knew she needed to move, find something to eat, a place to shelter. But each step was a fight against exhaustion and discouragement. As she pushed her stroller down the sidewalk, Margaret looked up at the sky. The bright blue seemed to mock his misery. How could the world remain so beautiful when her life had become so dark? "One day at a time," she repeated to herself, a survival mantra. "You can do it, Margaret. You have to." The tempting aroma of coffee and toast wafted through the doors of the Sunnyside diner, making Margaret's stomach turn painfully. She stopped in front of the window, looking at the people inside, warm and well-fed. Her reflection in the glass scared her, tangled gray hair, sunken eyes, shabby clothes. Almost unrecognizable. Just a coffee, thought Margaret, gathering her courage. Maybe they'll let me stay for a while. On shaky legs, she pushed open the door, the bell jingling happily. The warmth enveloped her like a long-forgotten hug, but the customers' gazes pierced her like icy daggers. "Can I help?" The waitress's voice was as cold as the wind outside. Margaret swallowed. A coffee please. To go." The waitress wrinkled her nose. "It's $3. Margaret's hands shook as she searched her pockets, counting coins. "I have $2.75. Please, that's all I have." "Then it's not enough," the waitress replied impatiently. "You need to leave." Margaret's heart sank. She could feel the looks of pity and disgust from the other customers. Shame burned in his chest. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's so cold outside." "I said get out." The waitress's voice rose, attracting more attention. Suddenly, a hoarse voice sounded from behind Margaret. "I'll pay for her coffee. And a full meal too." Margaret turned around, surprised. A tall man, with unshaven beard and clothes as worn as hers, stood there. His blue eyes sparkled with a mixture of compassion and determination. "Jack," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "Come sit with me." Stunned, Margaret followed Jack to a table. She could feel the shocked looks from the other customers, hear the whispers of disapproval. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Jack smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Because someone did the same for me once. And because no one deserves to go hungry." The tears Margaret had been holding back finally spilled over. "Thank you," she sobbed, gratitude mixed with the humiliation of her situation. As they ate, Margaret and Jack shared snippets of their stories. The hot food was a balm not only for their hungry bodies, but also for their lonely souls. However, Margaret couldn't help but notice something strange about Jack's behavior. He seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to walk in at any moment. "Everything is fine?" she asked, worried. Jack forced a smile. "Of course, just the habit of always being alert, you know how it is." But Margaret could sense there was more to the story. Something in Jack's gaze, a mixture of fear and resignation, made his heart sink. Who was this man really? And why did he seem to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders? As they finished their meal, the doorbell jingled again. Jack froze, his face visibly paling. Margaret followed his gaze and saw a group of men in suits entering the restaurant, their eyes sweeping the place with a predatory intensity. "Margaret," Jack whispered, his voice shaking with urgency. "I need you to trust me. When I say so, get out of here as quickly as you can. And don't look back." Margaret's heart quickened. What was happening? Who were those men? And what secrets was Jack hiding? Margaret's heart beat frantically against her chest as she watched Jack, her eyes fixed on the men in suits who had just entered. The air in the restaurant seemed to have grown thick, charged with palpable tension. "Now," Jack whispered urgently, his eyes never leaving the entrance. "Go, Margaret." Through the back door. Hesitantly, Margaret stood up, her legs shaking. "Jack, what's going on? Who are they?" "There's no time," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Trust me, please." With her heart in her throat, Margaret headed toward the back of the restaurant, stealing glances over her shoulder. She saw Jack slowly stand up, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Gentlemen," she heard him say, his voice surprisingly calm. "I think we have unfinished business." The sound of chairs being dragged and raised voices filled the air. Margaret pushed open the back door, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She ran down the alley, fear driving her weary steps. After a few blocks, Margaret stopped, panting, leaning against a brick wall. His world was spinning. Who was Jack really? Why were those men looking for him? And why had he helped her? Hours passed, and Margaret wandered the streets, her mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. The sun was beginning to set when she finally worked up the courage to return to the Sunnyside diner. The restaurant was quiet, almost empty. There was no sign of Jack or the mysterious men. Margaret approached the counter, where the same waitress from before was looking at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Your friend," the waitress began hesitantly. "He left you something." She handed Margaret a crumpled envelope. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened it, finding inside a hastily scribbled note and some banknotes. "Margaret, I'm sorry for bringing you into this. The money should help for a while. There is a shelter at 5th and Main, ask for Sister Mary. Say Jack sent it. Stay safe. G." Tears blurred Margaret's vision. She held the note to her chest, feeling a confusing mix of gratitude, fear, and a strange sense of loss. "He seemed worried about you," the waitress commented, her voice softer now. "Who was he?" Margaret looked at her, a sad smile on her lips. "An angel," she replied. "Or maybe a demon. I really don't know." That night, lying in a bed in Jack's shelter, Margaret couldn't sleep. His mind ran through the day's events, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Jack. A sudden noise made her sit up, alert. Footsteps approached his bed. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Margaret gasped. "Shoo," Jack's familiar voice sounded softly. "Don't be afraid. I promised I'd take care of you, remember?" "Jacques." Margaret whispered in disbelief. "What's going on? Why were those men after you?" Jack sat on the edge of the bed, his face a mask of tiredness and worry. "It's a long story, Margaret. One that I never wanted you to be a part of. But now you need to know the truth." He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "I'm not who you think I am. And what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." The silence in the shelter was almost palpable as Margaret stared at Jack, her heart hammering against her chest. The dim moonlight that filtered through the window cast unsettling shadows over his face, accentuating the lines of worry and tiredness. "Margaret," Jack began, his voice low and husky, "my real name is Jonathan Blackwood. 5 years ago, I was an executive at one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in the country." Margaret gasped, her eyes widening in surprise. "Jack or Jonathan," continued, his words filled with regret. "I discovered that the company was falsifying drug test results, putting lives at risk for profit. I had all the proof, I was ready to expose everything." He paused, closing his eyes for a moment, as if reliving a painful memory. "But they found out. The night I planned to take the evidence to the authorities, my house exploded. My wife, my daughter." Jack's voice trailed off, and Margaret instinctively reached out, touching his arm in a gesture of comfort. She could feel the tremor running through his body. "They died, Margaret. And I should have died too. But I survived, and ever since, I've been living in the shadows, gathering more evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The men in the restaurant. Corporate goons, Jack confirmed, his gaze hardening. They never stopped looking for me. And now, after all these years, I'm so close to finishing my mission. But... He looked straight into Margaret's eyes, his expression a mix of determination and fear. But I made a mistake. By helping you, I put you in danger. They might have seen you with me, and now... A sudden noise outside made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor, approaching quickly. Drug. Jack hissed, standing up abruptly. They found us. Margaret, we need to go. Now. Panic gripped Margaret as she stood up, her legs shaking. Jack, I can't. I'm not strong enough for this. Jack grabbed his hands, his eyes glowing with a fierce intensity. You're stronger than you think, Margaret. You've survived on the streets for years. You can do this. We can do this together. At that moment, the bedroom door opened violently. Two shadowy figures filled the entrance, their silhouettes menacing against the light of the hallway. Blackwood. A deep voice thundered. It's over. Hand over the documents, and maybe we'll let the old woman live. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement. Margaret felt fear run down her spine, but something inside her lit up. A courage she didn't know she possessed. She looked at Jack, seeing in him not just the man who had saved her, but someone fighting for justice, someone who had risked everything to do the right thing. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. It's not over. With a quick movement, Margaret grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and threw it at the intruders. The sound of breaking glass and surprised screams filled the air. Come on. Jack shouted, grabbing Margaret's hand and pulling her towards the window. As they escaped through the emergency exit, Margaret's heart beat frantically. She knew her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer just a homeless elderly woman struggling to survive. Now she was at the center of a dangerous conspiracy, on the run alongside a man carrying secrets capable of bringing down a powerful corporation. As they ran through the night, Margaret felt a mixture of fear and excitement that she hadn't experienced in decades. The future was uncertain and dangerous, but for the first time in years, she felt like her life had a purpose. The rain fell mercilessly over Chicago, drenching Margaret and Jack as they ran through the dark, deserted streets. The sound of their footsteps mixed with the pitter-patter of water on the rooftops and the occasional distant roar of thunder. This way, Jack panted, pulling Margaret into a narrow alley. They leaned against a cold, damp wall, trying to catch their breath. Margaret felt every beat of her heart, every painful breath in her aging lungs. She had never imagined that, at 68 years old, she would be on the run like a criminal. Jack, she whispered between gasps, what do we do now? Jack's eyes glowed in the darkness, a mix of determination and fear. I have a hiding place. A place where I kept all the evidence. If we can get there. A sudden noise made them freeze. Headlights from a car illuminated the entrance to the alley, and male voices echoed in the night. They must have gone this way. Panic threatened to engulf Margaret, but she felt Jack's hand tighten around hers, conveying a silent strength. Margaret, Jack whispered, his voice shaking slightly, I need you to do something for me. Something that could change everything. She stared at him, feeling the weight of that moment. What? Jack took a small flash drive out of his pocket. Here's everything. All the evidence. If something happens to me, you need to take it to the press, the police, whoever you can trust. Margaret felt the object in her hand, surprisingly heavy for something so small. But Jack, I can't. You can, he insisted, his eyes boring into hers. You're stronger than you think, Margaret. You always have been. The voices got closer. Jack looked toward the alley exit and then back at Margaret, making a painful decision. I'll distract them. You run in the opposite direction. There's a cafe called Blue Moon 3 blocks away. Go there and ask for Charlie. He'll help you. No. Margaret protested, tears mixing with the rain on her face. I won't leave you. Jack held her face in his hands, a sad smile on his lips. You already saved me, Margaret. You reminded me that there is still goodness in this world. Now it's my turn to save you. Before she could protest again, Jack gently pushed her into the shadows and walked out of the alley, shouting to attract the pursuers' attention. Margaret watched, horrified, as Jack was surrounded by 4 men. She wanted to scream, to run to help him, but she knew that would make her sacrifice useless. Heartbroken, she turned and ran in the opposite direction, the flash drive clutched in her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The streets passed by in a blur as she ran, driven by fear and adrenaline. Every sound made her jump, imagining pursuers around every corner. Finally, soaked and exhausted, Margaret spotted the neon sign for the Blue Moon Cafe. She entered, shaking, attracting curious looks from the few night customers. I need to talk to Charlie, she panted to the astonished barista. Seconds later, a middle-aged man with graying hair emerged from the kitchen, his eyes widening at the sight of Margaret. My God, he murmured. You must be Margaret. Jack told me you might come. Where is he? The tears that Margaret had been holding back finally spilled over. He sacrificed himself so I could escape. Charlie closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the blow. When he opened them again, there was a fierce determination in them. Come with me, he said, leading Margaret toward the back of the cafe. We have a lot of work to do. As she followed Charlie, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Jack had trusted her to complete his mission, to expose the truth that had cost him so much. The basement of the Blue Moon Cafe was a maze of old equipment and dusty boxes. Charlie guided Margaret through the chaos to a door hidden behind a bookcase. With a click, the door opened, revealing a small room filled with computers and monitors. Welcome to our headquarters, Charlie said, his voice low and strained. Jack and I have been putting this together for years, waiting for this moment. Margaret looked around, stunned. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. Charlie, I don't know what to do. Jack trusted me, but I'm just a homeless, elderly woman. How can I help? Charlie looked at her, his eyes shining with a mix of compassion and determination. Margaret, you are so much more than that. Jack saw something in you, something special. And now, you hold the key to exposing one of the greatest corporate conspiracies in history. With shaking hands, Margaret handed Charlie the flash drive. He inserted it into one of the computers, and immediately the screen filled with documents, emails, and spreadsheets. My God, Charlie muttered, his eyes quickly scanning the information. This is bigger than we imagined. Margaret, with this we can take down not just the corporation, but expose a network of corruption that extends into the government. The weight of the situation fell on Margaret like a ton of bricks. But what about Jack? We can't just abandon him. Charlie hesitated, pain evident in his eyes. Margaret, Jack knew the risks. A sudden noise from upstairs interrupted them. Heavy footsteps and muffled voices echoed through the basement. Drug. Charlie hissed. They found us. Margaret, we need to act quickly. With nimble fingers, Charlie began typing furiously, transferring the files to secure servers. I'm going to send this to journalists and news agencies across the country. Once it's out there, they can no longer stifle the truth. Margaret felt panic rising within her. What about us? What do we do? The footsteps approached. Charlie looked at her, a difficult decision forming in his eyes. Margaret, you need to go. There's an emergency exit behind that panel. It leads to a tunnel 3 blocks away. No. Margaret protested, tears welling in her eyes. I won't leave you either. Charlie held her hands, his voice urgent. You must survive to tell this story. To honor Jack's sacrifice. Promise me you will keep fighting. Heartbroken, Margaret nodded. Charlie pressed a cell phone in his hands. Use this to contact me when you're safe. Now go. Margaret ran to the panel, glancing one last time at Charlie before entering the dark tunnel. The sound of doors being kicked down echoed behind her as she walked through the darkness. Minutes that seemed like hours passed until Margaret emerged onto a deserted street. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. Exhausted, soaked, and emotionally drained, Margaret leaned against a wall, trying to process everything that had happened. Jack, the man who had saved her, was possibly dead. Charlie was facing God knows what in that basement. And she, an elderly woman who just a few days ago had nothing but a shopping cart, now carried the weight of a truth that could change the world. The cell phone in her hand vibrated, making her jump. A message from Charlie flashed on the screen. It's done. The truth is out there. Find reporter Sarah Chun at the Chicago Tribune. She'll help. Good luck, Margaret. The world needs you now. Margaret looked up at the brightening sky, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. His journey was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. With hesitant but steady steps, she began walking towards the city center. Old Margaret, the invisible homeless woman, was left behind in that dark alley. Now she was a warrior, a bringer of truth, walking toward an uncertain but purposeful future. And as the first headlines began to explode on phones and screens across the city, Margaret knew the world would never be the same. And she, against all odds, was in the eye of that storm. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement.